Hello everyone, and welcome to another recorded lecture of BIO101 online. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 7, which is on photosynthesis. So let's go back to the very beginning when we described all organisms as either able to produce their own energy or able to consume other organisms for energy. So there's two types of organisms. Autotrophs produce their own energy. We also call autotrophs producers because they produce their own energy. Heterotrophs must consume other organisms for energy. So since they must consume other organisms, we call them consumers. And the food chain looks a little something like this. It all starts from producers. So this grass is considered a producer because it can produce its own energy. The grass doesn't need to eat anything else. The grass just relies on the energy from the sun. And we'll talk about, of course, this is what this entire chapter is about, is how this grass can just sit in the sun, get rained on, and then it just has all the energy it needs. This grasshopper is not as lucky. This grasshopper cannot just sit in the sun and get watered and then produce its own energy. It must consume a producer or another consumer for energy. So I want to point out that all living things depend on producers, right? We all depend on things that produce their own energy by photosynthesis. So just because, as we'll soon see, we do not do photosynthesis, we definitely depend on it. Our lives depend on photosynthesis, but we don't do it ourselves. So back to the food chain. We have this grasshopper that eats the grass. That's how this grasshopper got energy. Then this frog is considered a secondary consumer because this will eat the grasshopper. This tertiary consumer, the snake, will consume the frog. And the final consumer, the hawk, would eat the snake. Finally, once this hawk dies, its body will decompose and microorganisms and fungi will start eating away at the molecules that made up the hawk, and the energy can then be repurposed for the decomposers. So energy is recycled in a way, but we know that energy is not a full cycle. Why? So I want you to think about what we learned in the last chapter about energy. So is all of the energy contained in this grass going to make it into this decomposer? Yes or no? Right? The answer is no, because in every step of energy transformation, we lose some of the energy as heat. So this food chain is not perfect. We don't maximize the amount of energy at every level of consumption. But this is how all organisms depend on producers. That's the purpose of this slide. So autotrophs produce their own energy. Heterotrophs must consume other organisms in order to get that energy. So autotrophs produce their own energy by carrying out photosynthesis. So prokaryotes, like cyanobacteria, carry out photosynthesis mainly in water. Eukaryotes, like algae and plants, carry out photosynthesis both in the water and on land. So you can see, and no archaea are known to do photosynthesis at all. So you can see in this table, bacteria and eukaryotes do have photosynthesis. We'll soon see that in eukaryotes, photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts. So plants and algae have chloroplasts, and that's where photosynthesis occurs. In prokaryotes, there is no chloroplast because there are no organelles. So they do photosynthesis in their cytoplasm. And cyanobacteria, again, is one of the examples of aquatic bacteria that can produce their own sugars using the energy from the sun. So we're going to focus mostly on photosynthesis in plants for this topic. So we said before that plants can capture solar energy from the sun to produce chemical energy. And this chemical energy is in the form of carbohydrates, right? We know that organisms use carbohydrates as an immediate energy source. And the way to look at this is that energy from the sun is being used to form bonds between very low energy molecules, like water and carbon dioxide, to create high energy molecules, like glucose. Remember, in order to get smaller things into a bigger thing, we need to input energy, right? It's an endergonic reaction that requires energy. So the energy comes from the sun. The sun is basically infusing these low energy molecules like CO2 and water to become a higher powered glucose molecule. And glucose has bonds in it, and those bonds contain energy. We need help in order to transmit solar energy into the cell itself. So chlorophyll is a molecule that can absorb and store solar energy. Think of chlorophyll as a solar panel, right? It can absorb the energy from the sun, and it can transmit it to be used in the cell. So chlorophyll is the molecule that can absorb solar energy, and chlorophyll is found in the chloroplasts. So in this leaf, you could zoom into a plant cell. You could see multiple chloroplasts, and this is what one chloroplast looks like. Chlorophyll is special because it has some electrons that can be excited, quote unquote. And what that means is that they're going to be moved to a higher energy level. So when these special electrons get exposed to sunlight, they get excited to a higher energy level. And we're going to see how these high energy electrons are able to transfer the energy to other molecules to make sugar. That's the goal of photosynthesis. We're making sugar. Right? Energy from these electrons are going to be used to reduce CO2 into carbohydrates. Remember, reduction means adding electrons. So what we're doing is we're adding electrons to CO2, to carbon dioxide, to build it up into a much more high-powered carbohydrate. Right? Carbohydrates have energy that can be used by the cell. CO2 is useless, and electrons on their own are useless. So photosynthesis will put all this together and allow the cells to make sugar. All right, so photosynthesis produces glucose and oxygen. And photosynthetic organisms need just a few simple ingredients to make their own glucose. Sunlight is the first ingredient, perhaps the most important, right? Without the sun, none of us would be here. No plants would be here. We need CO2, right? So plants rely on carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And finally, water. So these are the ingredients. This is the equation for photosynthesis. So we need the ingredients of CO2, water, and sunlight in order to get out glucose and oxygen. So here's a little fun fact, just to see how effective photosynthesis is. Each year, Autotrophs on Earth produce up to 200 billion tons of sugar. That's impossible to conceive. To try to make it a little easier, imagine a whole Empire State Building made of sugar cubes. So try to just visualize that. This entire skyscraper just made of sugar cubes. So now, imagine how much sugar is going to be produced by all of the organisms on Earth per year by photosynthesis. It would be the equivalent of 2 million Empire State Buildings made of sugar cubes. Again, this is impossible to conceive with the human brain. It's hard enough to imagine, 2,000 Empire State Buildings. So imagine 2 million Empire State Buildings, all made of pure sugar. That's the amount of sugar that's made by all photosynthetic organisms every year. So clearly, photosynthesis is very effective. It's good at what it does. And we are very thankful for photosynthesis because, again, we would not be here if photosynthesis were not constantly occurring. And photosynthesis of the past fuels the present. So we have a lot of our energy from coal, from oil. So that's what powers our computers, it powers our factories. So all this energy, where does it come from? So coal and oil provide over 80% of the energy needed to power our vehicles and all of our appliances and our computers and everything. But all of that energy came from photosynthesis. So the energy that you're using right now to power your computer actually came from photosynthesis. But this is, of course, hundreds of millions of years ago. So what happened, coal and oil, right, are called fossil fuels, right? These are fuels and they're called fossils because they're hundreds of millions of years old. And what they're made of, so coal was once photosynthetic organisms that were living in a swamp. But over millions of years, all these photosynthetic organisms were buried under water and dirt. So all these dead plants kind of just like got compressed. And a lot of the heat and pressure ended up turning the dead plants into coal. Remember, coal is mostly carbon bonded together. So we can burn coal in order to release energy. That energy was only there because these plants took CO2 from the environment, right? And was able to reduce it down to carbohydrates. So all the carbohydrates of the dead plants were fossilized, and that's where the coal that we use today comes from. Same idea with natural gas. We have to dig deep into oceans. We have to drill down through layers of sand and rock to reach oil and gas deposits. But the oil and gas came from fossilized plant and animal remains from hundreds of millions of years ago. These organisms, again, relied on energy from the sun in order to make their own energy. These animals had to consume other photosynthetic organisms in order to survive. So again, when you think about the fuels we use today, they originated hundreds of millions of years ago, and all because of photosynthesis. So take a second to pause here and answer this question. So a good strategy with multiple choice is to think about the answer first before looking at the choices. So photosynthesis is advantageous because B, they can make their own food. Yes, it's true they produce oxygen. Yes, it's true that they make food for heterotrophs. Yes, it's true that they use carbon dioxide. But photosynthesis is evolutionarily advantageous because organisms can produce their own food. So B is the best answer. So let's zoom in to a plant leaf. So in green plants, we said photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts, and chloroplasts are found in certain plant cells. So the leaf tissue is made up of mesophyll cells. This is like the actual cross-section of the leaf. And what we could do is we can zoom into one of these cells, one of these plant cells here, and let's grab one of these chloroplasts and zoom in. So there's many, many chloroplasts in each plant cell. And if we were to look here, this is a see-through window through a chloroplast. And chloroplasts have two membranes. They have an outer membrane and an inner membrane, but they also have a third type of membrane called thylakoid membranes. And thylakoids are these discs, they're like flattened membrane sacs that are arranged in stacks. And these stacks are called graina, is plural. Each one is called a grainum. So these are overlapping thylakoids in a grainum here. And chlorophyll is contained in the thylakoid membrane. So that's important for you to know. So chlorophyll is contained within the thylakoid membrane. Outside of the thylakoid is called the stroma. So the space outside the thylakoid is called the stroma. Something that sounds like stroma but is completely irrelevant are these stoma. So a stoma is a little pore underneath the undersides of leaves, and we'll talk about why that's important. But you should know these terms. As far as like plant cell anatomy goes, you should understand what a thylakoid is, grana, stoma, stroma, and understand the membranes of a plant cell and of a chloroplast. So let's talk about the ingredients for photosynthesis. We said we need CO2, right? Carbon dioxide. Well, how do plants get carbon dioxide? We have these special pores called stomata that allow plants to inhale CO2 from the environment. And then when they make oxygen as a waste product, they can exhale that oxygen through these pores. So again, these are little openings on the undersides of leaves that can open up, allowing CO2 to go in, which is an ingredient for photosynthesis. And then oxygen can leave. That's the oxygen we eventually breathe. And stomata can open or close, depending on the conditions. So when it's very hot and dry out, the stomata might be closed because you don't want to lose too much water. Stoma is a singular pore, where stomata is plural pores. So how do plants get water? Rain, right? Rain is the key to how we get hydrated. So the roots of plants can absorb water that moves up the vascular tissue of plants. So the vascular tissue is like almost like blood vessels in a way. And they absorb the roots absorb water from the ground and deliver it to the tissues of the leaf so they can perform photosynthesis. So we know that rain is the second ingredient. Finally, the third ingredient is sunlight. How do plants get energy from the sun? Well, this is probably the most complicated part. The sun emits energy in waves of photons. A photon is a particle of light. And the sun emits a huge spectrum of wavelengths of energy. This is called the electromagnetic spectrum. So all types of energy leave the sun and exit to the solar system. But on Earth, only a short portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, right, is exposed. So only a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum reaches Earth's surface. But if we wanted to see the entire range of wavelengths, we have the very short wavelengths, high energy gamma rays and X-rays. Those are luckily, like the higher energy wavelengths are filtered out. They're screened out by the ozone layer in the atmosphere before they reach Earth's surface. So we don't get a lot of these X-rays and gamma rays on Earth's surface. We then have UV radiation, visible light, and IR, infrared radiation. So this is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that reaches Earth's surface. Mostly, it's visible light. These lower energy, longer wavelength types of energy like microwaves and radio waves also end up getting filtered out. They get filtered out by water vapor and carbon dioxide. So again, what we're focusing on is this visible light. Visible light is the most prevalent form of energy that comes from the sun to planet Earth. So organisms, living organisms, evolved to use visible light to energize their cellular activities. So, for example, the human eye responds only to visible light, to different wavelengths of light between 400 and 700 nanometers. Plants, again, only respond to these kinds of wavelengths of light. So living things kind of adapted to use the portion of the sun's electromagnetic spectrum that reaches Earth. So plants capture photons of visible light. So these are the wavelengths of light that are visible to us as colors. So this is a little complicated. but everything has a color based on what types of energy it absorbs and what type of energy it reflects. So let's talk about pigments. This will help illustrate the idea of absorption and reflection of energy. So a pigment, like chlorophyll, can capture energy from the light. But each pigment specializes in absorbing energy only from a particular wavelength of light. So what this means is a pigment can't just take all the energy from the sun equally and be just as excited. Each pigment responds to a certain wavelength of light. In particular, right, chlorophyll is a certain pigment that only absorbs light in the blue, violet, and red range. So these blues and violets and the reds type of light are what can power chlorophyll. What you're looking at on this graph is called an absorption spectrum. So what you're looking at are the peaks. You're looking like chlorophyll A is shown in this green over here. So this is showing the wavelengths of light that it can use. Right? So when you look at, this is the absorption. So if it can absorb a lot of light, that means it can use light in this region. So plants use light in the lower wavelengths that are in the blue-violet range, and also the red range, the higher wavelengths. This helps explain, right? So only absorbed light is useful for photosynthesis. Only the blues, violets, and reds are going to be useful for photosynthesis. So leaf pigments do not absorb green light. They just can't use it. The green light part of the visible spectrum just doesn't do anything for chlorophyll. It can't power the electrons in chlorophyll. This is why this is why leaves look green, because the green light can't be used by the plants, right? All of this visible light is hitting the plant, but the plant can use the red, it can use the blues, it can use the purple, it cannot use the greens and yellows. That light is reflected off of the leaf. And that's why when those photons hit our retina, when we look at a plant, it looks green. Because it's absorbing, it's using all the other wavelengths of light, except the green. So what we see in color is the wavelengths of light that are reflected off of objects. So if you see something that looks yellow, it's because of the wavelength of light corresponds to around 550 nanometers of light. And I'm simplifying here for BIO101. So what I want you to understand from this is that from the sun, we have a huge spectrum of energy that reaches Earth's surface. The most relevant for us is the visible region. You might have heard Roy-Gabiv are the colors of the rainbow, like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. But out of all of these colors, leaves that have chlorophyll can only utilize the blues, the purples, and the reds. They cannot utilize the greens and the yellows, and that's why that kind of light, those wavelengths of light are reflected off, and that's why we perceive leaves to be green. So the chlorophyll pigments are critical to capturing sunlight. And again, because they can capture red, blue, and purple sunlight, they reflect off green. So that's why we see leaves as being green. And all the chlorophyll is embedded in the thylakoid membrane, we said. So we're going to take a second. I would like you to watch this video right now.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis.
So why are leaves green? So pause here. And the answer is C. Right? They absorb almost every wavelength except for green. So pigments are located in photosystems. Photosystems. So a photosystem is basically a large protein structure that's in the thylakoid. It's a membrane complex, but it contains a pigment. So a photosystem is a protein structure that contains a pigment. That's what a photosystem is. There are two important photosystems that we'll talk about in photosynthesis. There's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Both photosystems have what are called antenna pigments and then a reaction center chlorophyll. Within this reaction center chlorophyll, and this is what chlorophyll looks like up close, right? It's an organic molecule. Within this molecule of chlorophyll are a special pair of electrons that can be excited by certain wavelengths of light from the sun. So we just saw that certain wavelengths of light that fall in the blue, red, and purple area of visible light are able to excite electrons in this reaction center chlorophyll. And when light energy hits leaves, all of these little antenna pigments could transmit the light from one pigment to the next until it goes to this chlorophyll. And the whole process starts when the special electrons in chlorophyll get excited by light from the sun. So this is the first start of photosynthesis. We have special electrons in the reaction center chlorophyll within a photosystem gets excited. The electrons get excited. And all that means is that low energy electrons are energized to a higher state, higher energy level. Right? So the sunlight excites electrons in chlorophyll to become higher energy. High energy means low stability. Right? So high energy electrons are not very useful to us because they're very unstable. And we don't like instability, right? So how can we use this energy from the excited electrons? Think about the electrons as hot coals, right? A hot coal on its own is not very useful to heat up food because you can't hold on to it. It's very, very hot, very high energy, but it's very unstable. So we have what are called energy carriers. Energy carriers. NADP plus is a cofactor that can carry energy. Think of it as an empty battery almost. So NADP plus is a cofactor. Remember, a cofactor is a molecule that allows an enzyme to work. So we want NADP plus is a cofactor that can carry energy. So NADP plus can accept these unstable high energy electrons and hold on to them. And when it gets those two high energy electrons, NADP plus becomes NADPH. So is this reduction or oxidation? Is NADP plus getting reduced or oxidized here? Right, it's being reduced. So the high energy electrons from chlorophyll can be added to NADP plus to make it NADPH. NADPH is the fully charged battery, right? In the fully reduced form, that's the charged battery. And now we could use NADPH as an energy source. So you could think of it as like the hot coals were the electrons. So what we need is a pan to hold them. NADP plus is like the empty pan that can hold on to the hot coals. It can hold on to the electrons. And then it could drop them off where they're needed. That's what NADP plus is doing. It's holding on to the electrons, and it can drop it off later when they're needed. Note that with reduction, when electrons are added, so are hydrogens. So that's where the H comes from, because it has to be a balance, it has to be a neutral molecule. So with electrons come hydrogens. So NADPH is the fully charged battery. We call that the electron carrier. Right, you could also think about the electrons as being a hot potato, and the oven mitt, right, is like the electron carrier that can hold on to the hot potato, so you could transfer it to another plate. So recall that photosynthesis is a redox reaction. So in redox, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain of electrons. And when electrons are gained, so are hydrogens. Remember oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. And in general, reduction reactions are anabolic. Right? When you're adding electrons to something, you're building. Right? You're adding hydrogens and electrons. You're building something up. That usually requires energy. So that would be endergonic. Oxidation reactions are catabolic. That's when you lose electrons. You lose hydrogens. So what's happening in photosynthesis, CO2 is becoming reduced. We're adding hydrogens and electrons to CO2 to become sugar. And we're oxidizing water. Right? We're removing electrons and hydrogens from water to form oxygen gas. So water is being oxidized into oxygen. Carbon dioxide is being reduced into sugar in photosynthesis. So remember, reduction and oxidation happen at the same time. That's why it's called redox. And we're going to focus a lot on respiration in the next chapter and comparing respiration to photosynthesis. But I want to take a quick look right now at comparing the two. A lot of students get confused between photosynthesis and respiration and plants and animals. So let's try to clear this up. In photosynthesis, plants want to capture solar energy from the sun to make chemical energy as glucose. So they're converting the solar energy into chemical energy. Cellular respiration is the next step for plants. They then convert the chemical energy from glucose into ATP. So what the plant is doing, it's taking CO2 and water and using the energy from the sun to build these up into glucose. And then respiration, right? Respiration is the next step that uses the glucose and the oxygen to produce ATP. So ATP is the ultimate goal of photosynthesis and respiration. So remember, plants have to do photosynthesis and respiration. With animal cells, we can't make glucose on our own, right? We start by eating molecules. We eat food. That gets broken down into nutrients that we can then extract ATP from. We can't make our own energy. So now we're going to look at photosynthesis step by step. And here's the overview of the reaction, we're getting carbon dioxide and water, plus light, of course, gives us sugar and oxygen. And you can always think about the word photosynthesis to think about the two parts. So there's two parts of photosynthesis. There's the photo part. That's called the light reactions. It's called the light reactions because it's dependent on light. And then you have the synthesis part. Those are called the carbon reactions or the Calvin cycle. So I know I don't like this much either, but there are a lot of redundant terms. So the carbon reaction is the same thing as the Calvin cycle. Calvin was the one who discovered the carbon cycle. But I want you to know that the light reactions require light. That's what the photo part is. And then synthesis, we're making sugar. That happens in the carbon reactions and the Calvin cycle. So this is going to be a very important diagram to refer back into, because what I want you to focus most on are inputs and outputs. So what goes into each reaction, what comes out of each reaction. How do the two reactions interplay with each other? So a good way to keep track of this is a cheat sheet. You have the two steps of photosynthesis. Where in the chloroplast does it happen? What's the main goal? What goes in? What goes out? And what are the main enzymes involved? So you should keep track using a graph like this, a table like this. And another way to keep track of the information is by completing this diagram with descriptions of each numbered event. This is a very simplified view of the light reactions of photosynthesis, but it's the easiest way to kind of trace your understanding. So what I would do is, once you feel like you've studied, take a blank sheet of paper and write down what happens at each step in this image, all on your own, and then compare it with the book. And I actually have these things filled out at the end of the slideshow, but you can compare it with the answers to really test your understanding. So I'd like you to get a brief overview just by looking at this video, and then we'll start talking in more detail.
Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated.
Great. So, the main goal of the light reaction is to capture energy from the sun and store it in other molecules. Right, that's the best way I can try to summarize it. What we're basically doing is charging batteries that we can then use in the next step. This happens in the thylakoids of a chloroplast. And what we're going to see is that chlorophyll absorbs solar energy from the sun and stores that energy in NADPH. That was our energy carrier. We're going to also be able to make a little bit of ATP. Water, which is another reactant of photosynthesis, will be split into hydrogen ions, which are also protons, and oxygen. The oxygen will be released into the atmosphere as a waste product. And interestingly, and very importantly, these hydrogen ions are pumped into the thylakoid to create a pH gradient. And this pH gradient would allow ATP to be synthesized. So remember that when you put things against their concentration gradient, right, that requires energy to do that. So we're going to establish a pH gradient, and we're going to be using the potential energy of that gradient to make ATP. This might be a little confusing right now, but we're going to break it down. So inputs into the light reaction are sunlight, water, right? That's the light reaction. So whenever you think about what you need to take care of a plant, right, you need to put it in the sun and give it water. That's what you need for the light reactions. What we're going to get out are charged molecules like ATP and NADPH. Those are our main outputs. Of course, we also get oxygen, which gets released into the atmosphere. It doesn't get used into the next cycle, in the next step. ATP and NADPH are the two things that are going to be required for the second part of photosynthesis. So this is an overview, right? In goes water and sunlight. We're going to get some energy carrying molecules at the end, and we're going to release oxygen. That's the summary of the light reactions, which happen in the thylakoid. So let's zoom into the thylakoid now. And we said there are two photosystems. And confusingly, photosystem 2 is the first one to get excited by sunlight. And again, it was just the order in which they were discovered kind of confuses the numbers, but photosystem 2 contains a special reaction center chlorophyll. Right? Remember, chlorophyll, this is chlorophyll over here in photosystem 2. This chlorophyll has special electrons in it. So the first step, so again, let's situate ourselves. We're in a thylakoid. In the thylakoid, we have these photosystems, which are protein complexes plus a pigment. So this is a protein complex that contains chlorophyll. The chlorophyll has two low energy electrons that absorb energy from the sun. That's the first step. Step 1, energy is absorbed by the sun. Step 2, energy from the sun splits water. So water molecules are broken down into 3 different parts. The oxygen part is released into the atmosphere. The H pluses, the protons, are transported into the thylakoid. And we'll talk about why that's very important soon. So the H pluses from water are pumped across the thylakoid. And the electrons are going to be used to replenish the low energy electrons that were just excited by the sun. So water has 3 purposes. The oxygen will be released as oxygen gas. The protons are pumped inside the thylakoid, and the electrons will constantly replenish those of the reaction center chlorophyll. So we're going to talk about this again in detail, but what you're going to probably have to do is watch this video a few times to kind of make all the connections between the different parts. I tried to organize it in the most logical way as possible to make it easy for you to understand, but just the nature of photosynthesis it's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. So you're going to have to review this quite some time before your brain will synthesize everything together so it makes sense. So give yourself some time. So the electrons that were just energized by the sun are going to be carried to the electron transport chain. And that's where we're going to end off for now. So the electron transport chain is a series of thylakoid membrane proteins that can pass along excited electrons. So again, let's zoom out. This is the thylakoid membrane. And this is our photosystem 2. This is our reaction center chlorophyll. So energy from the sun is going to be directed toward this reaction center chlorophyll, and electrons will be excited. So those high energy electrons get passed along the electron transport chain, which is again proteins in the membrane that can pass high energy electrons from one protein to the next. Recall that water also gets broken down by light. It's called photolysis because you're using light to break down something. So water gets broken down into oxygen, which gets released, and we get protons, the electrons from water will replace those that were just energized by light in the reaction center chlorophyll. This is the important part. As these high energy electrons from chlorophyll are passed along the electron transport chain from one protein to the next, H pluses, protons, can be pumped inside the thylakoid. So we're going to see that H pluses can be pumped against their concentration gradient into the thylakoid. So we're going to talk about this in a bit, why this is so important. Why this concentration gradient is so important. So that was photosystem 2. All we did was pumped H pluses into the thylakoid so far. That's all we did. So again, I just want to make sure you understand, right? Step 1, energy was absorbed from the sun. Those electrons were passed along the electron transport chain to transport hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane. So now what we have at the end of photosystem 2 is a bunch of hydrogen ions in the thylakoid membrane. Photosystem 1 is the next photosystem. So again, we have a separate chlorophyll molecule here. And energy from the sun will excite the electrons in photosystem 1. They actually absorb a slightly different wavelength of light. So the photosystem 1 electrons get excited by a slightly different wavelength of light. But regardless, these high energy electrons are not used to pump protons inside the thylakoid. These energized electrons will be used to make the energy carrier NADPH. So these electrons that were energized in chlorophyll will be added to NADP plus to make NADPH. Remember, that's like a charged battery. And NADPH is needed in the next phase, which is the Calvin cycle. So again, at photosystem 1, those electrons in the chlorophyll are excited. Those are used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. So you get a stored battery. Now, remember all those H pluses that were pumped into the thylakoid by the electron transport chain? These hydrogen ions now flow through a channel in the membrane down the concentration gradient. They're going to go from high concentration to low concentration. And as they go through that protein channel, they're going to power a special enzyme called ATP synthase. And ATP synthase can convert the potential energy from this concentration gradient into ATP. So ATP is formed when hydrogen ions go from high concentration to low concentration. All right, so this is very, very important. This is how we make ATP in the light reactions. What is the source of protons that are pumped across the thylakoid membrane? So pause here. The answer is water, right? Water gets broken down by light, and the protons are pumped across the membrane. So let's take a closer look at this ATP synthase. ATP synthase makes ATP from ADP and phosphate. This is a little diagram of what the ATP synthase looks like. It has a part called a rotor that actually spins. It can physically move. So the potential energy of this concentration gradient, like the proton gradient, can drive the spinning of this rotor. And as this protein rotor spins, ATP can be formed from ADP and phosphate. So again, as protons are passed through this channel from high concentration to low concentration, they allow this rotor to spin, which allows ATP to be formed. So again, the potential energy of the gradient can drive the kinetic movement of the enzyme, which will transfer the energy into ATP. This method of producing ATP is called chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis, because ATP production is tied to the establishment of a gradient. We're using osmosis. We're going from high concentration to low concentration with chemicals, and that is going to power the movement of this enzyme, which can make ATP. So this is called chemiosmosis. We're making ATP because the protons are moving from high concentration to low concentration. So that energy can be used to make the high-powered ATP molecules we need for the next part of photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis occurs in specialized organelles called chloroplasts. The internal membranes of chloroplasts are organized into sacs called thylakoids. Surrounding the thylakoid membrane system is a semi-liquid substance called stroma. Photosynthetic pigments are clustered together to form photosystems. When a photon of light strikes the reaction center of photosystem 2, it excites an electron. Two water molecules bind to an enzyme at the reaction center. This enzyme splits the water and uses the electrons from the water to replace the electrons removed from the reaction center. Oxygen is produced in this process. The primary electron acceptor for the light-energized electrons leaving photosystem 2 is plastoquinone. The reduced plastoquinone passes the excited electrons to a proton pump embedded in the membrane called the B6F complex. Arrival of the energetic electrons causes the B6F complex to pump protons from the stroma into the thylakoid space, thereby generating a proton gradient across the membrane. Because the thylakoid membrane is impermeable to protons, the protons in the stroma must pass through the channels provided by ATP synthase. As protons pass through, ADP is phosphorylated to ATP and released into the stroma. This process for making ATP is referred to as photophosphorylation.
Right,
when photosystem 1 absorbs a photon of light, its reaction center passes high-energy electrons to ferredoxin. The enzyme NADP reductase then transfers the electrons to NADP to form NADPH. Electrons lost from photosystem 1 are replaced by electrons generated from photosystem 2. A small protein called plastocyanin, PC, then carries the electrons from the B6F complex to photosystem 1.
So take a look at that. I'm going to have this replay a couple of times. You don't have to memorize the ferredoxin or the B6 complex. You have to know photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. You should know what each of them does and the steps, but this is a good way to just look at what's actually happening. I like that, this part shows you how it's a cycle of electrons. The electrons get excited and they move along this chain that allows us to produce ATP and NADPH. So this is a good time to summarize. So let's summarize the light reactions from the very beginning. Photosystem 2 in the thylakoid membrane has a special chlorophyll pigment that has electrons that can be excited by light. When those electrons in chlorophyll are excited, they get passed along the electron transport chain, which allows protons to be pumped inside the thylakoid membrane. So we're creating a pH gradient where the inside is very acidic. To replenish those electrons that were lost, water is split, and the electrons are used to replenish those that were passed along the electron transport chain. The water is actually the source of the protons that are being pumped inside the thylakoid. Oxygen is released into the atmosphere as a waste product. So that's what photosystem 2 is doing. We're getting protons inside of the thylakoid. At photosystem 1, we have this electron is being excited by a different wavelength of light, and this time the electrons are going to be used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. All of the protons that were pumped inside the thylakoid from this first part of the light reactions flow from high concentration to low concentration down ATP synthase, which can phosphorylate ADP into ATP by chemiosmosis. So at the end of the light reactions, we have NADPH and ATP, which are both energy-carrying molecules. So think about what this did. We said the goal of the light reactions was to capture energy from the sun and to store it in molecules. We captured energy from the sun and we stored it in NADPH and ATP. So pause here. And the answer is C. I'm not going to go through this again. I think it's redundant, but I'm showing you many different pictures so you can find the one that you like the best and really learn from it. I'm not giving you pictures with too much information in general. The book goes into a lot more detail. And when you're studying this, make sure that you use the questions, learning map that has the relevant terms. So you're not going to see ferredoxin, for example, or the cytochrome B6 complex. I don't need you to memorize that. So stick with the table, that cheat sheet table, and try to memorize inputs, outputs, and the main concepts behind each step. And this is a video that's contained in the ebook. I recommend you watching it. It just kind of summarizes what we spoke about so far of the light reactions. So you can watch this video in your Connect ebook. An interesting way to look at the light reactions is like with the transfer of energy in energy towers. So this is, again, a totally hypothetical example that helps illustrate how energy is being transferred. So first we start off in chlorophyll with like a low-powered electron, but a photon of light from the sun can power this electron to a very high energy state in photosystem 2. The electron gets passed along the electron transport chain, almost like a mill that makes ATP. As this spins, right, really what this is we're pumping H pluses to create a proton gradient that can be used to make ATP by ATP synthase. That electron from photosystem 2 goes to photosystem 1, which gets excited by another photon of light. And that electron is then used to reduce NADP plus into NADPH. So now we have a higher powered NADPH. So that's what we end off with. We have ATP and NADPH at the end of the light reactions. One last time. Step 1, light from the sun is going to activate and excite 2 electrons in this reaction center chlorophyll. The electrons will be passed along the electron transport chain. Meanwhile, water is being broken down into oxygen, which is released. These H pluses will be pumped into the thylakoid space using the electrons' energy as they're passed from one protein to the next. And that H plus gradient will be used to make ATP by ATP synthase. The electron goes to photosystem 1 and is then re-excited by a different photon of light, and those excited electrons are added to NADP plus to make NADPH. So here's the last animation.
Most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids, contain pairs of photosystems called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars.
So I like this video because it's a more accurate depiction too, because photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 are both working at the same time. Right, so I just narrated it as a linear process, but they're both performing their jobs at the same time. So it's almost like a cycle.
The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH.
Great. So I think now we are ready to move on to the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is also known as the carbon reactions. The main goal is to make carbohydrates from carbon dioxide using ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. So ATP and NADPH from the light reactions feed into the Calvin cycle, as well as CO2 from the atmosphere. And the ATP and the NADPH has energy in it that can be used to reduce CO2 into carbohydrates. Right? We're reducing it. So we're adding electrons and hydrogens to this CO2, which is a gas, to make high-powered sugar. The Calvin cycle, I said, is also known as the carbon reactions. It's also known as C3 photosynthesis because it forms 3 carbon products. And the first, again, I'm not going to go into too much, but think about C3 photosynthesis as the same thing as the carbon reactions, is the same thing as the Calvin cycle. This all occurs in the stroma of the chloroplasts, outside of the thylakoids. Right, so this is outside of the thylakoids. The inputs are CO2 from the atmosphere and ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. What we're going to get at the end are carbohydrates. Right, that's the whole purpose of photosynthesis. It's the synthesis part. We're synthesizing carbohydrates. So I really like this picture. I think you should definitely memorize it and make sure you're able to reproduce it on your own. You can see that the inputs, the light-dependent reactions, are light and water. Out we get oxygen. The ATP and NADPH from the light reactions feed into the Calvin cycle with carbon dioxide, and out we get carbohydrates. Which is not an input into the Calvin cycle. So pause here. And the answer is A. Electrons from photosystem 1 are used to, pause here. The answer is C. They're used to reduce NADP+. Good. So what plants can do is they fix carbon dioxide. What fixing means, so this is called carbon fixation. So plants and other autotrophs can take the carbon from carbon dioxide gas and fix it, quote unquote, into the bonds of a carbohydrate. So what we're doing is we're taking CO2, we're taking the carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're fixing it, we're attaching it to a 5-carbon sugar by the enzyme RUBP carboxylase. RUBP carboxylase is also known as Rubisco. It's actually the most prevalent enzyme on the planet. Right? Think about all the leaves on the trees and all the blades of grass. They all require this enzyme to make sugar. Not to mention all of the photosynthetic bacteria. So RUBP carboxylase is an enzyme that can take carbon dioxide as a gas and attach it to a 5-carbon molecule. So that's the first step. So we take carbon dioxide and we add it to a 5-carbon molecule. So again, if we get 1 carbon from carbon dioxide plus 5 carbons, we have a 6-carbon molecule. So when you see 6, like C6 means it's a 6-carbon molecule. And again, this is the level of depth of information you need to know. So the book goes into a lot more detail about every step. I'm not going to make you memorize that. So after CO2 is added to a 5-carbon sugar by Rubisco, that 6-carbon molecule splits into 2 3-carbon molecules called phosphoglycerates. So we have 2 3-carbon molecules of phosphoglycerate, or PGA. Phosphoglycerate then becomes reduced by ATP and NADPH to become the high-powered glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, also known as G3P or PGAL. So I want you to remember G3P for sure, because G3P is what goes on to make the glucose. And we can say carbon dioxide was fixed because it was once just carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but now it's part of a carbohydrate. It's part of a physical sugar. This G3P can be used to make not only sugars, but also into proteins and oils. So everything that a plant needs can be made from this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So let's just review. Step 1 was CO2 from the atmosphere is added to a 5-carbon sugar to make a 6-carbon sugar. That 6-carbon sugar is broken down into 2 3-carbon sugars, which are then activated by ATP and NADPH to make glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. That glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate can then be used to make sugars, proteins, or oils. The cycle then regenerates, and this thing keeps on going and going and going. So that's why it's called the Calvin cycle. So this is the image from the book. This shows you how, this is showing you the actual numbers of metabolites. I don't need you to know the numbers. But 3 CO2s get added to 3 5-carbon molecules to make 6-carbon molecules. Right, that's the fixation part. Those molecules get broken down into the phosphoglycerates, and those get reduced by ATP and NADPH. That's the reduction part. We're powering these molecules using the energy in ATP and NADPH that ultimately came from the sun. Finally, the G3P can be used to make glucose or other organic molecules. And the RUBP is regenerated, so the cycle can't complete. So let's watch this video.
Plast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH, and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Calvin cycle reactions. The Calvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is then used to make glucose, fatty acids, or glycerol. It takes 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to make 1 molecule of glucose phosphate. Thus, the Calvin cycle has to run 6 times to produce 1 molecule of glucose. These molecules can remove their phosphate and add fructose to form sucrose, the molecule plants use to transport carbohydrates throughout their system. Glucose phosphate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of starch and cellulose.
Great. So like I mentioned, G3P can be used to make many other molecules. So this G3P can be used to make glucose, like simple sugars, which can then be formed, they can join with fructose to form sucrose. So sucrose is the sugar, this disaccharide found in fruits. G3P can also be made into fatty acids and glycerol to make plant oils, like olive oil, right? Olive trees, olive plant requires photosynthesis to make G3P, so it can then be made into oil. And of course, we can compress and extract the oil from olives, the fruit. G3P can also be made into amino acids which can be built into proteins. So G3P, which is a product of the Calvin cycle, could be converted to the building blocks of a plant cell. So, final overview. We said that chlorophyll and the thylakoid membranes of a chloroplast have special electrons that get excited by solar energy from the sun. Input into the light reactions are water, ADP, and NADPH, and then we get powered versions of these molecules. We have NADPH and ATP. Out goes oxygen. The NADPH and the ATP get fed into the Calvin cycle reactions, as well as CO2. This all occurs in the stroma. And the output of the Calvin cycle reactions are G3P, which could be made into sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids. So just from energy from the sun, the plant can make everything it needs to survive. All right, so you should definitely know everything on this diagram. So plants could use different carbon fixation pathways. And so far, we have been studying C3 photosynthesis, which is used by most plant species that live in cool, moist climates. It's like a sycamore tree. Is usually in cool, moist climates. And that's where C3 photosynthesis, like we just studied, is perfectly fine. And it's called C3 because there's a 3-carbon phosphoglycerate formed after carbon fixation. That's a side point. But plants that live in hot climates cannot use the same pathways for carbon fixation. And each pathway has its own advantages and disadvantages depending on the environment that the plant is in. So the different types of photosynthesis really gives us an opportunity to consider that different organisms are metabolically adapted to their specific environment. So let's talk about C3 plants. The whole time we spoke about C3 plants, and these plants do the light reactions and the Calvin cycle in the same cell. So we said that leaves are made of mesophyll cells, and a mesophyll cell in a C3 plant is the location of both reactions. All right, so the chloroplasts within a mesophyll cell is where the light reaction and the Calvin cycle both occur. Also recall that mesophyll cells are inside of the leaves, right by these stomata, these pores. They're openings in the undersides of leaves right by the mesophyll cells. So in hot, dry weather, these stomata are going to want to close to make sure water doesn't evaporate. Right? So in hot, dry weather, the stomata of C3 plants close up to conserve water. And as a result, no CO2 can get in and no O2 can get out. So in order to conserve water, we're basically preventing photosynthesis from occurring. And what happens is oxygen ends up building up inside of the leaf, and that causes photosynthesis to go in the opposite direction. It decreases the efficiency of the Calvin cycle when you have a lot of oxygen and not a lot of CO2. This is called photorespiration. So photorespiration occurs when there's a lot of oxygen built up inside of the leaf and not enough CO2. So photorespiration is going to happen when the stomata are closed in hot, dry weather. So plants in drier climates have adapted to avoid photorespiration. So C4 and CAM plants are two different types of plants that have adapted to hot, dry weather. And C4 and CAM plants divide up the two steps of photosynthesis either by cellular location or by time. So C4 plants we'll talk about first. C4 plants are ones that perform the Calvin cycle in a different location altogether, that are away from the stomata. So let's look at, here we see the stoma, there's a pore right by the location of photosynthesis in a C3 plant. In a C4 plant, the light reactions occur in mesophyll cells, but the Calvin cycle occurs in a different type of cell called bundle sheath cells. Bundle sheath cells. So these darker green cells over here do the Calvin cycle. These outer cells do the light reactions. And the bundle sheath cells that do the Calvin cycle are far away from the stomata. So photorespiration cannot occur. Right? When it's hot out, the stoma can still be open. And we can still get CO2 in and oxygen out. So photorespiration will not reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis in a C4 plant. So notice how the different arrangement of the cells, right, allows for different adaptations in the plant. So in C4 plants, they divide it up instead of Calvin cycle and the light reactions happening in the same cell that are right by the stoma. A C4 plant adopted it. They said, let's divide up the labor. Let's do light reactions in one type of cell, and we can keep the stomata open to get constant CO2 and oxygen exchange. And then we'll keep the Calvin cycle in a separate location, right? So they can get constant CO2, but they don't have to suffer from photorespiration. So a C4 plant is like corn. So let me just show you on this other slide. So a corn plant, right, does the light reactions in the mesophyll cells, but then transfers the carbon fixation part into the bundle sheath cell. So two separate locations. Whereas a C3 plant, everything is in the same cell. So the other type is called a CAM plant. So many desert plants like cacti are CAM plants. There are actually some orchids and lilies that do CAM photosynthesis as well. But CAM reactions, CAM plants all occur in mesophyll cells. So they didn't divide up the labor by types of cells. They still all do photosynthesis in the mesophyll cells, but they divide up the two steps by time. So in a CAM plant, stomata are only open at night, and that's when the Calvin cycle can occur. When it's not hot out, so there's not going to be a lot of water loss. So the stomata are open at night when it's cooler out, and that allows the proper exchange of CO2 and oxygen to happen. So photorespiration will not reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis. So I want you to just be familiar with these types of adaptations, but I'm not going to test you specifically on C4 and CAM photosynthesis. So it's a good idea to just check your understanding by going through these questions one by one to make sure you understand like the little details, and you can put all the little details into like a master picture of photosynthesis. So here are the cheat sheets filled out. This is what you should know at the very least. And to summarize, we said photosynthesis occurs in two stages: the light reactions and the carbon reactions. Light is the energy source for the light reactions. Water is the electron source for the light reactions. And the light reactions end up producing ATP and NADPH, while O2 is released as a waste product of the light reactions. The ATP and NADPH produced from the light reactions goes into the carbon reactions. So the ATP is an energy source, NADPH is an electron source for the carbon reactions, which use CO2 to produce sugar. So that's it for photosynthesis. There's one lecture review assignment that covers both chapter 7 and 8, and there's no separate quiz on this. So this will be covered on the midterm. So that's it for today, and I will see you next time for cell respiration.